So my story began in 1997. This is the story of my illness, really. Actually, I was born a bit before then, in case you were wondering. But back in 1997, if you rewind, we've just had the Blair landslide election, and at that time, I'm a reporter, I'm a junior reporter, and I'm working at the Times in the newsroom. And my husband is working in financial services, and he's also got aspirations to be a politician. And he stood at the 1997 election, and we split our life between Manchester and London. So life is pretty good. It's pretty exciting. I've got an exciting job. I've got the job I always dreamed of. We've also got 2 small children. But I'm stressed, and I'm pulled in different directions between my exciting job and my husband and my children. But I seem to be managing. And then what happens is that one night, I can't get to sleep. Now, any of you who know about depression and mental illness will know that insomnia is a key characteristic, but I didn't know that at the time. I'd had bits of insomnia before, but this insomnia was rather different, because with this insomnia came gradually some rather alarming physical symptoms. So as I lay there in bed, my heart rate speeded up, and I began to feel rather nauseous, like I had to vomit. I also started to have a rather worrying sensation that I was falling. I kept feeling that I had to hold on to something, that I had to kind of grip something. And with these alarming physical symptoms came some worrying thoughts. And my thoughts sort of went something like this. They were a bit like a kind of skater on the ice. And my thoughts went like this. They went, well, you know, if I can't get to sleep, I won't get to work. And if I won't get to work, I won't be able to pay the bills. And I won't be able to pay the bills, won't pay the mortgage. If I won't pay the mortgage, I'll lose the house. If I lose the house, I'll lose the children, I'll lose the job, I'll lose the job. Faster and faster. And more worrying. Now, this kind of thinking, I later discovered, is called rumination. And again, it's very classic of depressive thinking, as you go round and round and round and round. And as I say, these worries got worse and worse and worse, and it felt as if the sort of marks on the ice that a skater was making were sort of getting deeper and deeper. And the physical symptoms kept getting worse and worse and worse. But being supposedly this kind of high-functioning together sort of person, the next morning I thought, right, okay, I'll refasten activity to its normal timetable. I'll breakfast at breakfast time, I'll lunch at lunchtime, and I'll dine at dinner time, and of course I'll sleep at night time, and I'll be back on my busy, important, quote, high-functioning life. But unfortunately, my body had a life of its own, as indeed my mind, and I didn't sleep the next night, and I was getting iller and iller and iller, and by the 3rd night of not sleeping, I was in a really very terrifying state. I was screaming, and I felt unbelievably frightened and terrified, really, of what was happening. And I ended up in hospital. And when I got to the hospital, I said, look, I just don't know what's going on. I think I'm having a heart attack. And the doctor said, no. I'm a psychiatrist, and you're in a psychiatric hospital. And you are demonstrating all the signs of a classic, serious, anxiety-driven, depressive episode. Well, this was news to me because I didn't think of myself as someone who could suffer from depression. I didn't really know anything about depression. Anyway, we haven't got much time, so I'm going to cut a long story short. This is a 20-year story, but as I say, I was very, very unwell. I went into hospital. I was treated mainly with very strong drugs. I was treated with sleeping pills to try and sleep. I was treated with antidepressants and sedatives to try and bring down this state of heightened anxiety and all the symptoms. The symptoms of fear or flight gone crazy, so throwing up because I had to run, heart rate speeding up, so this was anxiety-led depression. I did get better after around 7 months of being very unwell, And I went back to work, to my busy, important job at the Times, and I told nobody. This is 1997. So if you think stigma is alive and well now, which it is, I can tell you, it was much worse in 1997. So I just pretty much, only my news editor knew, shut the topic down. I thought, I don't want to know about this. I don't want to be someone who suffers from depression or is mentally unwell. But what happened was that 7 years later, I had a second major depressive episode. This is very characteristic. I remember thinking at the time, it's a bit like a watercolour, and each time you go back, descend into the madness, the colours deepen and darken on the page. So it proved. I was very unwell again, and this time I was unwell, seriously unwell, by which I mean unable to function, unable to get up, for about a year and a half. I know that because I didn't do a single school run in that period, and I was still a mother of children. And that was something I really, really wanted to be able to do. So I was ill for a year and a half. I gradually got better, little by little, and that was about 10 years ago. So you might be wondering, what on earth has this got to do with forgiveness? But actually, I'm very drawn to the topic of forgiveness, and I'm very drawn to the Forgiveness Project, and that's partly why I'm so thrilled to be here. Because it turned out that forgiveness was actually going to be at the heart of my recovery. And the poetry that I'm drawn to, and I'm going to share a poem shortly, to me is really about forgiveness, because I actually needed to learn to forgive myself and to change the sort of person I was in terms of the emotions, the very strong emotions I'd had when I was so ill. And the two emotions I'd had most powerfully were, first of all, anger. I was furious. I was very, very furious. Why was this happening to me? Why should I be depressed? I came from a very privileged life. What on earth had I got to be depressed about? Why could this happen to me? And who was to blame for this depression? Was it my mother's fault? Was it my husband's fault? I was very, very angry. And the second very strong emotion I had was a very strong sense of low self-worth, and I wasn't good enough. Because when you feel depressed, you blame yourself, because it's not like a physical illness. You can't see anything, but you think it's your fault. And you think, well, what's wrong with me that I've done this, that I've got this horrible thing? What's wrong with me? Why have I got this? So these two very strong feelings of anger and low self-worth, in a way, forgiveness was at the heart of moving on from them and seeing them in a new way. And I think the reason that forgiveness means such a lot is that to get to forgiveness, I had to adopt a new emotion, find a new emotion, because forgiveness is not an emotion. What is an emotion is compassion and self-compassion. And even though it wouldn't have occurred to me when all this happened to me that I was lacking in self-compassion, in fact I was. And one of the things that was lovely when we were chatting earlier in the green room was all of us were discussing how different our stories seem over time. So at that time when I was so ill, I actually had very little self-compassion for myself. And what I had to learn was to develop self-compassion, not just for myself, but for others. But it had to start with myself. So in a way, the stories you've heard tonight have been about developing kind of forgiveness and compassion for very powerful family members. And my story is rather different. I had to learn compassion and forgiveness for myself. And there are really three ways that I did this. And what was really thrilling to me, that while I was on this journey, which has taken me 10 years, of trying to find this more compassionate voice, I discovered that in the world that I was interested in, which was the world of psychology and the world of mental health, that I wasn't alone. Others too, who suffer from mental illness, are also trying to find this compassionate voice. And it turns out that there's really interesting research on this topic. So in this world of mental health and mental illness, one of the great mantras that there's been has been this idea that we all need self-esteem. And if we have high self-esteem, we're going to be fine. And actually, I had quite high self-esteem. I had the fancy job, I had the house, I had the husband, had the children. I ticked a lot of boxes. It didn't save me from very debilitating depression. And what I learnt in my own story, and indeed in the world that I was so interested in, is that self-esteem, while it has some virtues, is actually a lousy model for good mental health and for a compassionate inner voice. Because self-esteem relies on our difference to others. My self-esteem at the Times is because I've written more news stories than you, or I've got a bigger picture byline. It's about difference. It's about being special. It's about being special as opposed to being worthless. So if I look back at my story, when I was so ill, I had gone back into being worthless. And I was always on this sort of mad treadmill that I had to feel special, with my successful career or whatever it was. And I think what I've had to learn is that I'm good enough just as I am. And we're all good enough. And I don't have to feel special. And if I stay feeling good enough, I'm less likely to fall into that dark place of feeling so worthless and so anxious. And on this very anxious treadmill, if you think about it for a minute, the model of self-esteem requires us to constantly be striving because we're not good enough. We're going to work harder and harder, and we're going to multitask more, and we're going to have more news stories and more supposedly signs of outward success. And this has only been exacerbated in a world of social media, which is constantly enumerating, supposedly, our specialness and our success and how many likes we have. And that world, which I know a lot from some of the problems that teenagers are facing today. So what I had to learn was a move away from this model of self-esteem to a model of self-compassion. And I'm going to just share 3 things that have helped me so much to get to a more self-compassionate relationship to myself. And compassion is the emotion. Forgiveness is where we're trying to get to. So how did I cultivate this sense of compassion? And there are 3 ways that I've found very helpful. So the first is this sense of an inner compassionate voice, a different voice. And this is why language is so important to me. My trade is words. I've always written ever since I was a child. I kept diaries. I then became a journalist. I'm now a writer. And I think the words and stories we tell ourselves are a big part of changing our language and how we develop a compassionate inner voice. And that's partly why poetry has been so important to me, because poetry has given me gentler phrases and gentler ways of talking to myself. And one phrase that I use an awful lot, which comes from the Bible, and it comes from Corinthians. And as many of you will know, the Bible is full of poetry. And when I was lying in my psychiatric hospital, hanging on for dear life, I used to repeat this mantra. I'm a great believer in mantras. I love them. And the mantra is this: my strength is made perfect in weakness. My strength is made perfect in weakness. So, first thing, a compassionate inner voice. I think the second thing that's been transformational in developing this compassionate voice and getting to forgiveness of myself and having a different view has been this sense of our common human experience, of how alike we all are. And mentioned this at the start of the talk. Marina mentioned we're in a world that's stressing difference. And I think the more you acknowledge our commonality, how alike we are, the easier it is to develop compassion, how flawed we all are, how perfectly imperfect we all are, that we're neither special nor are we worthless, but we're good enough. So that sense of commonality of our united human experience is something that helps me every day. And the last thing I want to touch on is poetry. I've mentioned it earlier in terms of finding the words to develop this different language to yourself, to stop the shoulds and oughts, the not good enoughs, to find a different language. But there's probably one poet who's meant most to me in finding another voice. And what I love about poetry, and I'm just so thrilled to be on stage with a real life poet, they are the best. They really are. What I love about poetry is that people who are the great wordsmiths, you heard a great wordsmith in action earlier tonight, they give us the language when we can't find the language. So I want to end by sharing a poem, and I'm just going to get a little bit of water before I do. So this poem first spoke to me when I was still very unwell, but over the years it's meant different things to me. It's a poem by George Herbert. George Herbert was a 17th century poet. Some of you will have heard of him. He was part of the metaphysical group of poets. He battled all his life with what I would now think of, or what we would now think of as depression. He wouldn't have been diagnosed, but he suffered tremendous hardship, and many of his poems are about a battle to find a good enough voice and to be acceptable to himself and compassionate to himself and forgiving to himself. And when I came across Love, I was electrified, because this poem, in 3 short verses, which I will share with you shortly, to me summed up my entire life. In this poem, I think you will hear 2 voices. You'll hear the voice of love, the voice of compassion, the voice of forgiveness. And you'll also hear the voice of the not good enough, the unworthy, the person who is unforgiving, we could say, on themselves. He was a religious poet. He was a priest. He is talking in a religious context. I hope that those of you that don't feel yourselves to be religious will enjoy this poem, because it speaks to a higher power, a higher spirit, whether that might be nature for some people or a religious God. It is for me. I was brought up a Catholic. But even if that's not something that's important to you, I hope you will get a sense of a higher sense in this poem, which has just been so helpful to me. So, we will end on another poem. And it goes like this. It's called Love, and it's by George Herbert. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. Yet quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, sweetly questioned if I lacked anything. What? I, the unkind, the unworthy, Lord, I cannot look on thee. Love, smiling, did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame? You must sit and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Thank you very much.